أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, most merciful. First let me express a word of thanks. I know it's a little chilly this evening to come out for this topic. And the topic is a complicated topic. This topic is filled with nuances, and unfortunately for this topic, it leaves a lot of room for serious misunderstandings, for distortions, and for outright misrepresentations. So it's important for me to say at the very beginning of this discussion that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is our ultimate role model. And so, yes, we can read and study and benefit from other people, both inside the Muslim community and outside of the Muslim community. Of course, we can benefit and learn and follow. But ultimately, for the Muslim, we are cognizant of what the Quran says. And in the Quran, Allah says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو اللَّهَ وَالْيَوْمَ الْآخِرَ وَذَكَرَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا. It says that indeed in the Messenger of Allah, in Muhammad, indeed in the Messenger of Allah, you have a goodly model for any who has hope in Allah in the final day and who contemplate upon Allah often or in abundance. ذَكَرَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا. There are, of course, many other verses of the Quran which emphasize the role and the importance of Prophet Muhammad. Allah's blessings and peace be upon him. Among the famous verses that are always read, that are always recited, is وَمَن يُطِعِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ فَقَدْ فَازَ فَوْزًا عَظِيمًا. That whosoever obeys Allah and His Messenger achieves a mighty achievement. And أَعْطِيُوا اللَّهَ وَأَعْطِيُوا الرَّسُولَ. You see that many times, obey Allah and obey the Messenger. So there's no way to get around it in Islam that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is extremely important. It cannot be divorced from one's practice or from one's understanding of Islam. So the next part of this discussion is a good question, and that is, well, where do hadiths come from? Where the people talk about hadith. Well, where do hadiths come from? Broadly speaking, I want to summarize the origin of hadith like this. The Prophet Muhammad, as a human being, would be accompanied by other human beings. He was always in the company of people, and these people were very careful in memorizing or recording everything that he said or did or approved of. In fact, the meaning of the word Sunnah, when he's mentioned in the form that you have, the meaning of the word Sunnah, as traditionally understood, is anything that the Prophet did, said, or approved of. And in particular, in terms of his followers preserving what he said and taught, among the most famous figures from which we get reports about Prophet Muhammad are his wife, Sayyidah Aisha, as well as Abu Hurairah. Now, the way in which all of this was preserved is that the reports come through what is called a chain of transmitters. It's called isnad in Arabic, or sanad in Arabic. And basically what it means is that from the report begins with a companion of the Prophet, or somebody that was contemporaneous with the Prophet, and it reaches this person and this person and this person and this person until it reaches the famous Hadith sources, or I should say the scholars who compiled the books of Hadith, which we'll get into shortly. And the books that were put into Hadith, the reports that were put into the Hadith books, the most authoritative of them, at least in Sunni tradition, is the first one is Sahih Bukhari, which is called Asahh al-Kutub ba'd Kitabillah, is called that, the most authentic of books after the scripture of Allah. And what comes after that is the Sahih of Muslim, Sahih Muslim. The other text, if you put these together with other sources, these are commonly called as Sahih Sitta, which means the 6 authentic books. So it's Bukhari and Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, and the Muwatta of Imam Malik. So then comes the question of, these chains of transmitters, what I just described, is this perfectly preserved? So before I answer that, let me say this, that the purpose of this presentation is to sort of give an introduction to where hadiths come from and how we should come to understand the source. So, go to the question, are the chains of reporters, the isnad, is it perfectly preserved? So the answer to that is a very complicated question. But what I'll say is that the hadith scholars, and by the hadith scholars I mean the compilers of the books of hadith, is that they did their best to investigate the lives of those who made the report. So if, for example, if so-and-so says, at some point that he heard from his teacher that the Prophet said X, Y, Z, then what these individuals will do, these hadith scholars, is what they would do is they spend time to look at the biography of the person who reported it. So if the person was known to be honest, if he was known to be a liar, if he was known to have deficiencies in memory, if he was known to have this, he was known to have that. So they tried basically an investigation of the characters and even the health of the people who reported these statements attributed to the Prophet. They tried as best as they could to discover if there were some deficiencies in those chains. So in the people who report the hadiths. Now, are there mistakes in those chains? Or are there mistakes or fraudulent things found in the reports themselves? And the answer to that is yes. It has never been denied by the Muslim scholars. It has never been denied at all. Actually, I should go in a different order, but I'm going to stick to this order. So, even with what I have just said, the preservation of the Sunnah, of the tradition, of the example of the Prophet Muhammad has been achieved. What I mean by that is that his life is well known. In other words, we know about his marriages, we know about his death, we know about his battles, we know where he's buried, we know about the treaties that he established, we know about his means of worship, we know about his personal habits. So what I mean when I say to that, I mean to sort of emphasize that yes, there are hadiths or reports attributed to the Prophet that are not true. Yes, that exists. And yes, there are deficiencies in the chains. Yes, that does exist, but in the broad scheme of things, we still know more about Muhammad, the Prophet of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We know the overall life and the overall legacy and the overall teachings. And this is why Muslims and non-Muslim scholarship basically agrees with what I have just said, meaning that no serious historian disputes the major details that are known about the life of Prophet Muhammad, in particular in his worship and things like that. Again, I'm moving relatively quickly because I'm interested to see if there are any discussions after this. So there is another question which happens to Muslims a lot. And this question is this: should Muslims, because I have just said, I have admitted that there are the science of Hadith is not perfect. I have just admitted that. So then the question is: should Muslims throw out Hadith altogether? Should we reject Hadith as a source? And the short answer to that is no. No, Muslims should not throw out Hadith altogether, because what happens is when Muslims throw out, and I've seen it, when Muslims throw out Hadith altogether, when they throw out the baby with the bathwater, what happens is that the religion itself becomes unraveled, especially in how it's practiced. The perfect example of this assertion is prayer. There are different Muslims who practice slightly different things, but when it comes to prayer, all of the Muslims agree about this basic format. There is standing, there is bowing, there is sujood, there is recitation of the Quran, there is various things. Like, all the Muslims agree about that basic format. And they agree to that basic format because this format is how Prophet Muhammad brought it to us, right? He brought to us that Maghrib is 3 rak'ahs. He brought it to us that the Salatul Isha is 4 rak'ahs. He brought this to us. And so this comes to us through the reports about the Prophet from the Hadith reports. So if a person, especially an educated person, if they reject Hadith totally, then what happens with the example of Salah is that there's no longer any kind of organized, uniform structure of Salah. So the Salah becomes an exercise in chaos. And all we need to do is to go to YouTube, and you can see some videos, whether in Urdu or in Turkish or even in English. There are videos on YouTube posted by people who do not believe that Hadith can be consulted even for Salah. And so they completely change around the Salah and make something new and again, very, very chaotic, very bizarre. I've seen some very bizarre examples of people trying to do Salah when they reject Hadith, and they end up, again, making very bizarre types of worship. So there are a couple of things I want to emphasize. I'm trying to move rather quickly because I'm interested in if any comments or reflections. Hadith is not sacred. It's not sacred because Hadith exists as reports. So their strength as evidences for a particular doctrine, a particular ritual, or a particular legal point, their strengths are always disputed. So what I mean by that is that one scholar may take a hadith as this is a strong evidence for XYZ. Another person says, no, I have a problem with this hadith. and do not take it as evidence, or they don't take it as a strong source of evidence. Sometimes the hadith literature, the hadith reports themselves are interpreted in light of principles that have been established by certain schools. And practically, they would be observed when, for example, noticing the manner in which the prayer is offered. And when we have the Q&A, I'll explain another example of that. There are a couple more points here that I really want to get to. And this point is a question. And I'm sure that as Muslims, we have all encountered this in our lives, is that what should we do when we hear someone tell us? Because it's usually not by a book, it's usually verbally. That someone says, well, Prophet Muhammad says X, Y, Z. And it is the most nonsensical, irrational thing you've ever heard in your life. What should we do when we encounter such a phenomenon? I'm going to share the answer and then give an example. The best thing to do when you encounter a statement that's attributed to the Prophet ﷺ that sounds a little wacky, the first thing that we should do is what the Quran says. It says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. It says to consult those who know if you do not know. So, if something sounds wacky to us, then more than likely it also sounded wacky to the scholars of the past. So, for normal people, for us normal people, I think the good thing to remember is that the Quran is the most reliable source of information. And every single hadith, not just hadith, but every single thing actually, should be examined in light of, or understood in light of the Quran. And if any hadith, in quotation marks, if any hadith goes against what the Quran says, then the Quran has to take precedence over what the hadith says. And so now let me give an example. I don't know if you were laugh or cry. Years ago, I was in a masjid, and there was a gentleman who had accepted Islam. And you know how Muslims do, they're sitting around in the masjid and they're talking to this person, congratulating this person, and telling him different things about religion. And someone said that everything in creation submits to God, which is true. But then a child emerges. He says, no. I learned that the sun, S-U-N, I learned that the sun was going to hell. So he says, my teacher told me that. So fortunately, his teacher was there. So I asked his teacher about that. And his teacher says, well, there is a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said that the sun will go to hell. So I said, that doesn't make any sense to me. I'm sorry, let me back up. He says that the sun is going to hell. So I said, why? He says, because people, that there are sun worshippers. That people worship the sun. So I said, that doesn't make sense to me. Because people worship Jesus. So by that logic, that means that Jesus Christ, alayhi salam, should go to hell because people worship him. So he became angry with me. He says, then you are a disbeliever. That was his reply to me. He says, you are a disbeliever. I said, fine, no problem, because I don't believe that. Because the Quran says, Ash-shamsu wal-qamaru bil-hasban, that the sun operates on a pattern that's determined by God. The Quran says that the sun submits to God. That's what the Quran says. Its existence is because of God. So, as it turns out, I researched this particular report later, after that, because I had never encountered this report before. And this report was classified as weak or even mawdu', even a fabrication. But somehow or another, there was a person, because he had heard the Prophet said it, he believed it. Which is not a bad thing, except that what our brother didn't do is he didn't think about it in light of the Quran. Not only did he not examine the tradition as to if the report was authentic or inauthentic, if it was weak or it was strong, or it was aziz or hasan or whatever, or gharib or whatever, he didn't do any of that. He accepted whatever he heard, but unfortunately, he didn't engage in critical thinking about this. So the Quran must take precedence over anything that we hear, because the Quran is the most important source for us. The next issue is, well, what hadith books should we read? In English, the Sahih Bukhari has, I believe, 10 volumes, maybe 12 volumes in Sahih Bukhari in English. So does anyone have time to read this? He says 4, but I've seen more.
I have the copy with four books.
For Bukhari.
Yeah.
Usually when they translate it, it's much more than that. It might be a summarized version.
Really?
Yeah. Because we have, even in English, we have Sahih Bukhari, which is, I believe, 10 volumes. And a lot of times what happens in modern age, they print summarized versions of these books. So it's I'm sure that's a summary. It can't be, maybe it excludes repetitions. But what Bukhari does have, Sahih Bukhari has over 7,000 different hadiths in it. 7,000. And Sahih Muslim has over 4,000 different hadiths in it. So for the most of us, we don't really have time to read these sources. So let me use this analogy. The appropriate analogy is that the hadith books are like medical books, right? So medical texts are really not for you and I. Medical texts are for those who work in the medical field. They serve as some sources of information for people who are working in the medical field. That's their job. That's just their livelihood. So the hadith books, with all their volumes and all their commentary and all their analysis, are really for those who are teaching about religion and writing about religion. However, just as in the medical field, they do publish small booklets, and they published maybe some volumes, as Brother Bilal just mentioned. They published some volumes of a reference text, like a medical reference text, in which you can look up a particular subject and see what they've written about a particular subject, like a little small blurb about a particular subject. So the hadith books also come like that, in that scholars have compiled hadith books that are beneficial for everybody, regardless of their status, regardless of their education. And some of the books, I have just a couple of books with me. This book here is 40 Hadith by Imam Nawawi. And it's just compiled by Imam Nawawi. And this is a very famous book. This is actually the smallest version of it I've ever seen. The smallest version I've ever seen. But we have this book, and it has actually not 40 hadiths, it has, I think, 42 hadith in it. And they're basically wise statements. They're statements that are meant to give inspiration and that sort of thing. Another book is Riyadh al-Salihin. This is also a copy I have. It's actually just a summary, because Riyadh al-Salihin comes in bigger form, but this is just a summary of Riyadh al-Salihin. And Riyadh al-Salihin is also by the same author, Imam Nawawi, or collected by Imam Nawawi, I should put it like that, categorized by Nawawi. And so it has in there hadith about different subjects, about spirituality, about the manners, about virtues, um, prohibited actions, um, a book of seeking forgiveness. It has different things like that. And I mentioned this on Friday, is this book, which is, I think is the best book about studying Prophet Muhammad himself. And it's called The Life of Muhammad by Muhammad Hussein Haykal. He's a famous Egyptian author. And this book is over 600 pages. But it's a very good reference to the life of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Last but not least, the Quran. Actually, not only not least, but most important, is the Quran. Because the Quran is, not only is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it is also the best source of information about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The best source of information. Because the Quran impacted the character, it impacted the actions and the behavior of the Prophet. And one of the principles that we should understand is that the Prophet ﷺ would not go against the revelation that is given to him. He wouldn't do that. So the Quran itself should be viewed as also the most important source and the most authentic source of information about who and what Prophet Muhammad was about, and what he did, and how he lived his life, and what teachings that he sought to deliver to the world, really, because he's rahmatan lil alameen. He is a mercy to those, to not just the Muslim, the mu'mineen, to believers, but he's rahmatan lil alameen, that he is a mercy to all humanity. This is what Prophet Muhammad was. He was a mercy to all humanity. Let me stop for a moment and invite if there are any comments or questions. Yes, sir.
Two questions.
Please.
How do we know the authenticity of a hadith, and that it was the actions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? How do we affirm that it's correct?
Good question. And what's the second one?
Second, I heard once someone told me that in the hellfire, there's mainly women. I heard that somewhere, and I didn't know if it was a hadith or not. I can't even remember where I heard it from, but someone once told me that, and I couldn't understand why that was.
Okay. Very important questions. For question one, how do we know the authenticity of a hadith?
Yes.
Okay. I will tell you how, I'll try to give a brief summary of how the Muslim scholars, the hadith scholars themselves did it. They employed many ways, and then they differed among themselves as to the strength of their methodologies. So basically what they did is they would analyze the chain of narrators, meaning if they were able to determine that it can be legitimately traced back to the time of the Prophet, and that the first initial reporter was in fact there when the Prophet was living, then they would accept it. Now, however, if there were certain defects in the chain, so for example, if someone was known to have been a liar, if someone was known to have weak memory, and someone was known to have certain character defects and all that. So what they would do is they would make their own decisions, the hadith scholars, which they sort of differ about, as to the strength of that report, in light of the fact that there might be individuals in the chain who are known to be this or known to be that or have certain defects.
Is it like distant family members or like people that people worked with or something like that? Somehow they had companionship, and then
essentially. And but even with that, so using that analogy, maybe there's a family member or a co-worker who he wasn't there all the time. He might have seen one thing but only saw it in a certain context. He might have heard one thing and then he mismemorized, like, he's got details mixed up. So those kinds of things existed. So for example, the Sahih Bukhari does not always have the same reports that Sahih Muslim has, right? And then when you get to the other hadith books, it becomes the conditions that they use to determine if a hadith is reliable or not, etc. They were sometimes different. So they mean their conditions were not always uniform. The second question, which is an important question, and it actually highlights what I was talking about, is the hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said that the majority of people who are inhabitants of hell would be women. That this is the. I'm going to talk about it. Yeah. So the basic answer to that is that this particular report. Let me share the whole thing. So the whole thing is that the Prophet reportedly said that we know during the time of what is called the Isra wal Mi'raj, during this experience where the Prophet essentially he makes a tour of heaven, he makes a tour of hell, and it is reported that he said that he noticed that the majority of the inhabitants of hell were women. Now, this has been variously explained. I'm ignoring for a moment if this is because this is disputed. There's a book called Authentication of Hadith by a very famous contemporary hadith scholar called Isra Ahmed Khan, who analyzes this particular hadith in a lot of detail. But traditionally, this report has been looked at in different ways. So some of the scholars understand this hadith that this report that you're talking about. Some of them think it's a joke, that the Prophet was actually joking. Really, if you read the literature, some people think that it is a joke. Some people think that it is because of, say for example, the quality of not being grateful to one's husband. So they have different ideas as to what this is. Now, let's go to the Quran. Now, I am unaware of a verse of the Quran that says the majority of people in the inhabitants of hellfire would be women. In fact, if we